The money was gone. So was she. 3 days after the funeral, my sister vanished along with $250,000. No calls, no apologies, just silence. I stared at the login screen of the joint account. The balance blinked back at me, $0. Not even a receipt. Not even a goodbye. But I didn't cry, I didn't scream. Instead, I clicked open a folder on my laptop. It was labeled "In Case She Runs." The light in the kitchen flickered as the fridge hummed behind me. The scent of peppermint tea drifted from the stove, Aunt Louisa's favorite. I hadn't moved her mug from the sink. Inside the folder were PDF files, notarized documents, asset logs, copies of the will, and a scanned release form Jenna signed without reading, disguised as funeral authorization. But it granted me full legal control over the joint account. Every penny, every piece of jewelry, every claim. Next to the folder sat an envelope. It was the one I gave Jenna 3 nights ago. She thought it held the key to my safe deposit box. She didn't know I had switched it. With steady fingers, I opened the spare. Inside was exactly what I told her I gave. A prepaid therapy card, a fake vintage key, and a handwritten note. "If you open this, you've already crossed the line." My hand didn't shake. Not this time. I made a cup of tea, took the seat by the window, watched the coastal light fade over Savannah's rooftops. I didn't lose my inheritance. I just gained back my peace. And this time I kept the receipts. Would you cry or be ready like I was? Where are you listening from? Has anyone ever betrayed your trust like this? Share your story below. Your voice matters. It started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. Aunt Louisa collapsed, the voice said. They're rushing her to Memorial. By the time I arrived, the sun had already dipped behind the marsh. The hallway outside ICU was too bright. The floor smelled like lemon cleaner and old grief. I stood there, fingers numb, watching her body struggle beneath too many wires. She didn't make it through the night. I sat beside her bed when the machines stopped. One hand on her frail fingers, the other in my lap, holding nothing but regret. No one else came. Not my mother, not Jenna, just me. That was November. I spent the winter handling her affairs, bank statements, utilities, the rental house on Tybee Island. It was small but full of her soul. Sea glass jars, hand-stitched pillows, a bookshelf that smelled like cedar and salt. She left everything to me. Not out of favoritism, but out of presence. Because when she needed someone in the middle of the night, it was me who answered. When she forgot how to open her medication bottle, it was my name she whispered. Not Jenna's. Jenna hadn't visited in over a year. But she called the day after the funeral. I'm so sorry I couldn't make it, she said, breathless. Work exploded. You know how it is. I didn't know. I hadn't had a day off in 4 months. You two were close, right? She added, as if testing a boundary. I'm sure she'd want you to have. Most of it. I remember blinking at that word. Most. Jenna was 6 years younger, and for as long as I could remember, she sparkled. Big eyes, easy laugh, a magnetic presence. She could charm waiters, strangers, parents, even Aunt Louisa. But she didn't stay. Not through illness, not through death. She swooped in for celebrations and sympathy posts. Never the work. The last time we saw each other in person was at my husband's funeral. Daniel died 2 years ago, pancreatic cancer. Fast, cruel, merciless. At the cemetery, Jenna wore a velvet coat and handed me tissues she never used herself. I'll visit soon, she said, kissing my cheek. She didn't. The will was clear. I sat in Walker's office, her lawyer, while he read it aloud. To Rachel Myers, who showed up not just in the light but in the dark. There were no disputes. No hidden clauses, just silence. Until Jenna showed up at my doorstep the next day. She wore a smile too wide and perfume too sweet. I just wanted to see you, she said, arms outstretched. I know this must be hard. I made tea out of politeness. She walked the house like she was taking inventory. Touched the carved frame of Louisa's mirror. Commented on the value of the vintage brooch. Then she said it. You know, I introduced you to Aunt Louisa again, right? After you stopped talking for all those years. I looked at her over my mug. She wanted you back, I said. But you never stayed. Jenna tilted her head. Well, maybe you wouldn't have had the chance if it weren't for me. Over the next few days, she visited more. Always checking in, always bringing coffee, always steering the conversation toward finances. You must be overwhelmed, she said, once watching me sort antique jewelry into labeled pouches. If you want, I could help hold some things. Just until you get settled. I didn't say yes. But I didn't say no either. Grief dulls your sharp edges. It makes you want to believe the best in someone you wish had been better. So when she offered to transfer part of the liquid inheritance, $250,000 into a joint temporary account, I agreed. It's just safer this way, she said. Paperwork takes time. You don't want checks bouncing with all these transitions. It sounded reasonable, even thoughtful. I created the account. Added both names. Watched the numbers flicker online. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and said, I'll handle it from here. That night I placed the sealed envelope in her hand. She looked at me confused. What's this? The safe box, I said. In case something happens before I sort the key situation. Oh wow, she said, cradling it like a treasure. You really trust me. I smiled but didn't answer. Because trust wasn't the point. The next morning she texted, taking a quick trip, just need air. We'll call you soon in air. That was the last message I ever got. 3 days later, the joint account was empty. The phone went straight to voicemail. Jenna was gone. I sat in my kitchen, same chair, same peppermint tea cooling beside me. The sun hit the photo of Aunt Louisa on the bookshelf. I looked at it longer than I meant to. Then I turned to my laptop. I clicked on the folder labeled In Case She Runs. Inside, a copy of the will. Itemized asset records with date, stamped photos. Screenshots of all account transfers, including hers. The notarized clause Jenna signed during her third visit, thinking it was a release form for estate documents. Walker helped me draft it. 2 years ago. Because I knew this might happen. Because some people never change. I stared at the screen, my fingers steady, my breath even. Some would call it paranoia, I call it preparation. But the hardest part wasn't the theft. It was realizing I'd been waiting for her to fail me. That I had hoped she wouldn't but planned for the moment she did. That I mourned her loss long before the money was gone. The envelope she held, it didn't contain a safe key, it contained a test. Would you trust your sister? Or test her, like I did? The silence was louder than her voice had ever been. 3 days, no calls, no messages. Not even one of her heart-shaped emojis she used to end every text. I tried calling. Once. Then again the next morning. Straight to voicemail. I checked the joint account again. 0. No pending transfers, no explanations, no flags. Just gone. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. Until the cursor stopped blinking like it was mocking me. It wasn't about the money. Not really, it was about the quiet theft. The way she did it without flinching, like I wouldn't notice. Like I didn't matter. The house felt heavier than usual. The drawer where I kept Louisa's brooch was open, empty. The antique gold watch was gone too. And the silver cufflinks Daniel wore the night we danced at my 40th birthday. I didn't remember giving her permission to touch those. Maybe I never said no. The peppermint tea had gone cold again. I picked up the mug, stared into it like it might answer something. What kind of sister smiles at you and steals what you were trusted to protect? I walked down the hall to the spare bedroom. It still smelled faintly like Jenna's perfume, sweet, artificial, too loud. On the bed a throw blanket she used was folded perfectly. Too perfectly. Like a hotel maid had done it. She left everything tidy, except the mess. That afternoon I called Walker. Rachel, he said gently. Have you opened the folder yet? Yes. And the release form, she signed it. There was a pause on the line. I heard the rustling of paper on his end. You did everything right. Then quieter, I'm sorry it came to this. That night, I pulled out Louisa's jewelry inventory. Page by page, I marked what was missing. The cameo necklace. The freshwater pearl ring. A box of antique hair combs from the 1940s. Things she never cared about when Louisa was alive. But now they were valuable. She hadn't taken the things with the most worth. She'd taken the ones with the most memory. The next morning, I called our mother. She answered on the second ring. Rachel. Finally, Jenna said she hasn't heard from you. What's going on? I nearly dropped the phone. She said what? She's worried. Said you've been off. That grief is making you paranoid. I sat down. Hard. She emptied our joint account, I said. Took the heirlooms. Vanished. There was a long pause. Then in a tone I hadn't heard in years. Well, maybe she needed it more than you. I felt something in me shift. Something I didn't have a name for yet. Mom, I said slowly. You think it's okay, she's your sister. Blood is blood. I wanted to laugh. Or scream. But all I did was whisper number it's not. After we hung up, I opened the last email Jenna sent me. It was from a week ago, subject line, ADAGI, for your files. Attached were some estate documents she offered to digitize for me. I hadn't looked at them before. I scrolled through them now. Everything was there. And everything had metadata showing she opened them at 3 a.m. the night before she vanished. One PDF stood out. The inventory. She highlighted everything she wanted. I saw the yellow boxes. Each one marked possible resale. My stomach turned. I stepped outside. The Savannah air was thick, but the breeze off the water cut through it. I walked the path Aunt Louisa used to sweep daily past the mailbox, the rosebush she trimmed with exact scissors every spring. And there beneath the porch mat, like a whisper, I found a second key. One Jenna must have made. I stood there barefoot, the wood cool beneath my feet, the fake key from the envelope still upstairs. She had planned both moves. Mine and hers. That evening, I received a text from an unknown number. You're overreacting. It's not theft. It's family. Jay, no apology. No acknowledgement, just entitlement. I didn't respond. Instead, I wrote an email to Walker. Subject line, execute clause B. He replied within the hour. Understood. Transfers will be reversed by legal order. Property claim reverts to your name. Do you want to initiate charges? I didn't answer that one. Not yet. Later that night, I sat with the photo album. Not digital, the old one. Leather binding, frayed edges, faint smell of dust and lavender. I turned each page slowly. Me and Louisa in her garden pruning tomatoes, Daniel with flour on his nose in the kitchen. Jenna, 7 years old, holding my hand at the zoo. I remembered all of them. But not all memories deserve to stay warm. I thought back to that sealed envelope I gave Jenna. She hadn't opened it. Not yet. But she would. And when she did, she'd understand. The fake key was heavy for something that led nowhere. But the therapy card was real. I'd chosen it intentionally. I didn't want revenge. I wanted her to see what she needed. Or at least, what I had needed all those years ago when I was the one drowning. I closed the album. Set it back on the shelf. Took the tea to the porch. And let the evening carry the weight for once. She didn't just take money, she took memories. But I still had something she didn't expect: documentation. Silence. And time. Would you call the police, or let karma do its job? The morning Jenna's name was officially removed from the account, the sky over Savannah turned gray. Rain tapped the windows with a steady rhythm, soft but unrelenting. It made everything feel slower, heavier. I stood by the sink holding a mug I hadn't filled, watching water bead and run down the glass like quiet tears. Walker called to confirm. The assets were back in my name, the funds were secured. The jewelry pieces Jenna hadn't sold yet were now on every alert list from Savannah to Charleston. I was safe, at least legally. But I didn't feel safe. I felt hollow. I hadn't told anyone else yet. Not because I was keeping it secret, but because I already knew what they would say. And I wasn't ready to hear it out loud. I made the mistake of calling Melissa. She and Jenna had been friends since high school. We used to have brunches back when Jenna and I could still sit at the same table without pretending. Melissa answered on speaker, her voice chirpy like I had just invited her for coffee. She said Jenna told her I had overreacted. I said Jenna had taken $250,000 and vanished. Melissa paused, then asked if maybe it was a misunderstanding. That was when I realized Jenna had already gotten to everyone. She'd spun her story, first wrapped herself in fragility, and handed them a version where she was the wounded bird. The poor little sister who was bullied by the cold, older one. I knew that story. I'd heard it all my life. Next came the call from our mother. Her voice wasn't warm this time. She asked if I had really frozen Jenna's access. I said yes. She emptied the account and disappeared. Our mother's tone turned sharp. She said Jenna had helped me after Louisa died, that maybe I was being ungrateful. She asked if I remembered how fragile Jenna had always been. I sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the tea I hadn't touched. She said maybe grief had made me paranoid. I felt something in me shift. Not break, just shift. I whispered that she believed Jenna over me. There was a silence I'd never heard from her before. Then she told me I'd always been the one who needed control. That maybe I'd finally snapped. I ended the call quietly. I didn't cry, but something closed inside me. I wasn't just mourning Louisa anymore. I was mourning being believed. I stared at the 2 envelopes on the table. One from the funeral home. One from the storage unit. They were reminders of all the things I had handled alone. Jenna had shown up when the spotlight turned on, but never when the real work began. I opened the photo app on my phone, scrolled past old moments. Jenna sipping wine in a vineyard. Louisa smiling behind a cake. Daniel holding me on our last vacation. In one photo, I spotted Jenna in the corner, half turned away from the lens. It struck me. She was always in the background. Present but not. Visible but never fully there. I remembered childhood. Me cleaning up the cranberry juice she spilled. Her scribbling hearts on the bathroom mirror while I scrubbed floors. Our mother saying, "She's just little, be the bigger one." I had been the bigger one for so long I didn't know how to be anything else. That week I received a letter from a law office I didn't recognize. Jenna was contesting the release form. She claimed emotional distress. Claimed I took advantage of her grief. She was rewriting the story. But this time I had the paper trail. I scanned the document and forwarded it to Walker. He called within an hour. She was bluffing, he said. And badly. But we'd still need to respond. I gave him the go-ahead. Later that evening I pulled the envelope from the drawer. The one I had given Jenna. I opened the spare I had kept for myself. The key inside was useless. A replica, a test. The therapy card was real. So was the note. If you open this, you've already crossed the line. I wondered if she had opened hers yet. I wondered if she felt anything. I thought about the first time she disappeared on me. I was 13. She ran away for a weekend, left nothing but a scarf on the porch swing. That time I waited by the window for hours. This time I didn't wait. That night I drove to the storage unit Louisa had kept for years. The hallway smelled like concrete and paper. The door creaked as I opened it. Inside the chest I found her apron folded neatly. Handwritten recipes, a tin of costume jewelry labeled for travel. None of it was valuable in the way Jenna wanted. But every piece was part of something real. I sat on the floor and held the apron in my lap. She hadn't left me a letter. But she left me this. Trust, proof, legacy. I whispered to the dark. She doesn't get to rewrite the story. Not this time. Not when I'm still here. Not when I'm still holding the truth. They chose to believe her. But I kept the records. I still had a voice. Would you defend yourself or let their version stand? I thought the worst part would be losing the money. It wasn't. The worst part was realizing I could be erased so easily. One sentence from my sister. One rumor from her lips. And suddenly, I became the unstable one, the cold one, the woman no one wanted to believe. That morning, I stood in the kitchen staring at my own name on a document Jenna had submitted in her claim. She accused me of manipulating her. Said I preyed on her grief to make her sign away what was rightfully hers. There were 2 typos in her statement. 2, she hadn't even cared enough to get it proofread. But it still shook me. Because it meant she was ready to lie under oath. I closed the folder and sat on the floor. Back pressed to the dishwasher. Eyes on the floor tiles I'd picked out after Daniel died. I remembered crying on those same tiles the night I had to sell our car to pay for medical bills. Jenna never showed up that night either. She texted a heart. That was it. I made a cup of tea but forgot to drink it. The cup sat untouched, steam curling and disappearing into the morning air. I felt invisible again. Not angry. Not righteous. Just tired. Later that day, I visited the cemetery. Louisa's headstone was small and simple. Just her name and a line she'd written herself. I stayed. That's what matters. I knelt beside her, brushing away leaves, and whispered, "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" The wind answered softly. That evening, my neighbor knocked on the door. Margaret, 61. Widowed twice. Wears lipstick even to take out the trash. She held out a Tupperware of baked ziti. I figured you hadn't eaten, she said, no questions asked. I invited her in. We sat on the couch, 2 women with decades behind them and too much to explain. I told her a piece of the story. Not all of it. Just enough. She didn't gasp. Didn't offer advice. She just listened. When I paused, she looked straight at me. You can burn yourself trying to keep people warm, Rachel. I looked down at the cup in my hands. It's my sister. Margaret didn't blink. And you're still a person. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan. I thought about the years I spent being the dependable one. The daughter who didn't ask for much. The wife who carried the weight when Daniel couldn't anymore. The niece who stayed when Louisa forgot her own name. And still, I was the one people left behind. I reached over to the nightstand and pulled open the drawer. Inside was a folded letter. I had written it weeks ago after the funeral. It wasn't addressed. I didn't even plan to send it. It was for Jenna. It said, I miss the version of you who used to braid my hair. I don't know who you are now. And I'm starting to think, maybe I never really did. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I ripped the letter in half. The next morning I met Walker at the firm. He looked at me carefully like he wasn't sure which version of me he'd find. I was dressed in jeans, hair pulled back, no makeup. But I walked in like a woman with both feet on the ground. He slid a folder across the table. Here's what she's trying to claim. I nodded. And here's what you've documented. Every file. Every timestamp. Every signature. Another nod. Rachel. He said, voice steady, do you want to fight this? Officially, I looked at the stack of papers between us. Then I looked out the window at the cars driving by, lives moving forward while mine stayed paused. I don't want revenge, I said. I want it to stop. I want to live again. Walker leaned back. Then we do this by the book. I went home and poured myself a glass of water. I sat by the window with the folder in my lap. The garden was quiet. The rosemary bush Louisa planted was still blooming. And I made a choice. I wouldn't be erased. I wouldn't beg to be believed. I would fight not with fire but with facts, with silence when needed, and strength when they least expected it. When you lose everything, do you still have the strength to protect what matters? The calls stopped. So did the messages. Even the ones accusing me of being cruel, bitter, unstable, they all faded. That silence was louder than any insult they could have thrown. And in that silence, something strange happened. I exhaled. Fully. For the first time in months, my chest didn't feel tight. The coffee still brewed at 7 a.m. out of habit. But I didn't sit by the window anymore waiting for explanations that wouldn't come. I opened my laptop instead. Clicked the folder I hadn't touched in weeks. Legal prepared responses. Inside were drafts, emails I never sent, screenshots, time logs, receipts. I sorted them again. Color-coded. Updated timestamps. No rage, no panic. Just precision. That morning, I called Walker's office. When his assistant answered, I asked one question. What's the cleanest way to finalize my boundary? She didn't ask what I meant. She put me on hold. Walker picked up a minute later. Rachel, if you're asking me that, then you already know what you need to do. I'm ready, I said. And I meant it. I spent the afternoon reviewing the trust account, the jewelry appraisals, the safe deposit logs. I removed Jenna's name from every record, flagged her as unauthorized on every file. No drama, no phone calls, no confrontation. Just erasure. Not revenge. Just reclaiming. That evening, I cleaned the spare bedroom. Her scent was gone now, so were her things. Her scarf. Her travel bag. But her ghost still lingered in the way the light hit the corner of the bed. I opened the closet. Inside, tucked behind a shoebox, was something I hadn't seen before, a receipt. From a pawn shop in Florida. Dated 2 weeks ago. She had sold Louisa's ring. The garnet one. The one Louisa wore every Christmas. I sat down on the bed. Stared at the paper like it could explain her to me. It didn't. I folded it and placed it inside the legal file. One more document. One more line of proof. But it still hurt, because some things aren't about value. They're about memory. And she gave it away. The next morning I drove downtown. The legal district was quiet. I parked, walked past the courthouse, and entered a nondescript building with tall glass windows. Inside, I signed documents. Spoke with clerks. Filed official declarations. Walker was there. He watched me sign my name with steady hands. When we were done, he said, "This doesn't mean it's over. But it means you're ahead." I nodded. That's all I ever wanted. Later that afternoon, I returned home to an email. Subject line: Final Petition, Jenna Myers. Attached a scanned handwritten statement from her. I was confused. I didn't understand what I signed. Rachel always had a way of making things seem final. I read it once, then deleted it. There was no new lie she could tell that I hadn't already prepared for. That night, I wrote my own letter. Not to Jenna. Not to anyone else. To myself. I wrote, "You survived being dismissed, ignored, rewritten. But you didn't vanish. You documented, you endured. You didn't need to scream to be strong." I folded the letter. Slid it into the folder labeled, "For Court, Personal Impact." I didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but I knew I had written it. And that mattered. A few days later, I received a call from a local news blogger. She'd heard 2 sides of the inheritance dispute. Asked if I wanted to give a quote. I declined. I didn't need headlines. I didn't need people to weigh in on what I knew had already cost me more than money ever could. Instead, I went for a walk. Down to Louisa's favorite bench by the marsh. The wind carried the scent of salt and earth. I closed my eyes. I could almost hear her humming. I didn't speak. I just sat there, letting the quiet remind me who I was before all this. Who I still was beneath the wreckage. I went home and made soup. Chopped vegetables slowly. Let the broth simmer for hours. The smell filled the house. I opened the windows. Lit a candle. Not for her, for me. That night I backed up every file. Printed 3 full sets. One for court, one for my safe, one for the drawer I never used. I labeled each binder. My story, unedited. I didn't know what Jenna would do next. Maybe she'd spin more stories. Maybe she'd disappear again. But I was done waiting for her version. I had written mine. And this time it came with evidence. And peace. There's a kind of justice that doesn't need noise. It just needs preparation. Would you choose confrontation or quiet power? The envelope arrived on a Thursday. Cream-colored. Thick paper, hand-addressed in blue ink. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Jenna's. Inside was a single page. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just a request. I think we should talk. I'll be in Savannah next week. It was signed with her name, no love, no warmth. Just Jenna. I read it twice. Then I folded it. Placed it next to the therapy card she had never returned. That night I didn't cry. I didn't spiral. I planned. I pulled out my notebook, the one I used for Louisa's care schedule, then Daniel's hospice rotation. It had become my journal for survival. At the top of a blank page I wrote, if she comes back, she won't find who she left. And beneath it a list. File official asset summary. Notify safe deposit manager. Reconfirm restraining clause with Walker. Prepare one letter. For her, just one. Book the space. The space was a small meeting room inside a historic inn downtown. Neutral, public. Quiet, no yelling. No scenes, just clarity. I reserved it for Wednesday at 11 a.m. No entourage. No drama. I would bring only myself and the folder. Walker called me the next day. He said he'd received a voicemail from Jenna's lawyer asking for settlement options. I told him, we settle nothing. He paused. Then asked, do you want me present if she shows up? No, I said. I want her to face the one person she never expected to stand up. Tuesday night I slept without dreams. The house was clean, the kitchen quiet, the air still. I laid out my clothes, navy slacks, white button-down, Louisa's small gold pin. Not a power move. Not an armor. Just myself. Prepared. Simple. Steady. The morning came with fog. I walked downtown, the cobblestones damp from overnight rain. The inn smelled like cinnamon and old books. The receptionist showed me to the room. A round table. 2 chairs. A glass pitcher of water. I sat facing the door. I didn't shake. I didn't fidget. At exactly 11:08 she walked in. Jenna looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from pretending too long. Her hair was pulled back too tightly, her heels clicked a little too loudly. She didn't smile. She sat down, eyes scanning me like she didn't recognize this version. Maybe she didn't. Maybe that was the point. She spoke first. You didn't have to make it this ugly. I didn't answer. She shifted. I was grieving. You blindsided me. I placed the folder on the table. Neatly, quietly. I opened it. 1 tab for bank transfers, 1 for jewelry appraisals, 1 for signatures, hers, 1 for the release form. Her eyes flinched at that one. I let the silence sit. Let her fill it. I didn't read what I signed, she said, voice smaller now. I trusted you. I looked up. I trusted you too. She blinked. Just once. I continued, voice steady. You took what you thought I wouldn't miss. You spun a version of me that people found easier to believe. I placed a printed copy of her pawnshop receipt on the table. Her face dropped. I needed money. You needed to ask. She looked at me like she wanted to cry. But no tears came. Only excuses. They always favored you, she said. Louisa left you everything. I leaned forward, slow and calm. Because I stayed. Not because I asked. That landed. I saw it in her shoulders. She wanted to argue, but couldn't. I handed her the letter. 1 page. Short. Clear. Final. You are no longer authorized on any account or property. Any attempt to reclaim or dispute these matters will be handled through legal means. This is my last communication with you outside official counsel. She read it. Her lips pressed together. She folded it. Didn't tear it. Didn't hand it back. Just held it in her lap. Then she reached into her purse. Pulled out something wrapped in tissue. She placed it on the table. I didn't touch it. She said. It's Louisa's garnet ring. I got it back. I didn't speak. I just nodded. That wasn't redemption. It was recognition. A small one. But I'd take it. She stood, no apology. But no more lies either. I won't bother you again. I know, I said. And she left. I sat alone for 5 minutes. Let the stillness settle. Then I gathered the papers. The receipt, the ring. I walked outside. The fog had lifted. The sun caught the windows of the buildings like it had been waiting. That night I took Louisa's ring and placed it in the small glass box on my bookshelf, next to Daniel's wedding band. Next to a photo of me smiling without makeup holding a cup of tea on Louisa's porch. No caption. Just a moment I wanted to remember. Then I sat down at my desk, opened a new folder on my computer. Titled it Peace. She came back expecting the woman she once manipulated. She found someone who no longer needed her approval. If someone finally handed back what they stole, would you forgive? Or just move on? 2 weeks after that meeting, my mother called. I let it ring 4 times before answering. Her voice was unusually flat. We got a letter from Jenna's lawyer. About the inheritance. I waited. She didn't tell us about the release form. I said nothing. She didn't tell us she sold Louisa's jewelry either. Still, I said nothing. Then she asked quietly, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I looked out the window. The rosemary bush Louisa planted was blooming again. I did, I said. You just didn't believe me. There was silence on the line. Then came the words I never thought I'd hear. I'm sorry. That Sunday I received an invitation. The family was hosting a small memorial event for Aunt Louisa. Delayed. Better timing, they said. They wanted to do it right. I almost threw it away. But then I remembered something Louisa used to say whenever things got complicated. Show up. Not for them. For you. So I did. The house was familiar, my childhood and its walls. Its air thick with old perfume-polished wood and something less tangible expectation. There were about 20 people. Cousins, aunts, neighbors. I brought lemon bars. Louisa's recipe. My mother greeted me with tired eyes. She didn't hug me, but she didn't avoid me either. That was enough. They played a slideshow. Old photos. Louisa in her garden. Louisa on the porch. Louisa reading to me under a blanket, flashlight in hand. Someone asked if I'd like to say a few words. I didn't prepare anything. But I nodded. I stepped forward. Cleared my throat. She wasn't flashy. She didn't chase attention, but she noticed everything. I paused. She saw who stayed. Who showed up. Even in silence. I didn't look at Jenna, but I knew she was watching. She taught me something I didn't understand until this year. Another pause. That peace isn't something you're given, it's something you build, one small hard decision at a time. Then I stepped back. No applause. Just stillness. The kind that doesn't need noise to be heard. Later, Jenna approached me by the sink where I was rinsing a dish. She didn't say anything at first. Then softly, "I didn't expect you to come." I handed her a towel. "I didn't come for you." She nodded. Once. Then added, "I told them the truth. About the money. About the documents." I looked at her. "Why now?" She shrugged. I kept telling myself I had reasons, but they weren't good ones. Silence again. Then she asked, "Do you hate me?" I wiped my hands on a cloth. Met her eyes. "Number, I just don't trust you." She nodded again, and for once she didn't try to fix that. That week the case was closed. The court acknowledged the release form as binding. No further disputes would be processed. My lawyer sent a short message, "Your file is complete. No appeals filed." I printed it, filed it in the drawer, then locked it. The following Friday I got a knock on my door. It was Melissa. Jenna's old friend. The one who once told me I might be paranoid. She held a brown paper bag and a bottle of red wine. "I came to apologize," she said. I raised an eyebrow. I believed her because it was easier. But I read the court records. "I'm sorry." I didn't invite her in. But I took the wine. "I hope you're well," I said. And gently closed the door. Closure didn't arrive like fireworks. It arrived like this. The mailbox held no legal letters. The phone didn't light up with demands. The air in the house felt light again. The photo of me and Louisa on the windowsill finally looked like it belonged there again. That night I lit a candle for Daniel. Not for grief. For thanks. He once told me people show you who they are when they think you won't fight back. He was right, but I did fight. Just not the way they expected. A few days later, I hosted dinner. Not for family. For Margaret. For Walker. For a new neighbor who just moved in with 2 kids and no furniture. We ate in the kitchen. Drank wine. Laughed about nothing. I looked around the table and thought, this is what legacy can look like too. Not the money, not the property, but the space we build after betrayal. The peace we choose to protect. Later that evening, I sat by the bookshelf, next to Louisa's garnet ring, next to Daniel's wedding band, next to a new photo, just me holding a cup of tea, smiling like someone who remembered how justice didn't come with applause, it came with clarity and space to breathe again. Would you have stayed silent or made them see the truth? The first morning I didn't think about Jenna, I was making toast. The light came through the kitchen blinds at just the right angle, soft and golden. The kettle whistled. The rosemary on the windowsill was growing wild. And I stood there in my robe, barefoot, smiling without realizing it. That's when I knew something had shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But quietly, the way healing usually begins. I didn't throw anything away after all this. Not the photos. Not the jewelry. Not the folder labeled in case she runs. I kept them. Because those pieces weren't just evidence. They were proof I lived through something and came out whole. One afternoon I opened the drawer where Daniel's letters were. I reread the one he left for me a month before he passed. It ended with a single sentence. Let them underestimate you, just make sure you never do. I folded it carefully. Placed it next to the letter I'd written to myself during the worst days with Jenna. Then I took both letters and moved them to a new file. I labeled it closure. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. Bills still came, work still got stressful. Grief still hit me some days, unexpected and sharp like a cold gust down the back of my neck. But peace wasn't about the absence of pain, it was about knowing I could hold it and still stand up straight. A few weeks later, I started offering design consultations again. I took on fewer clients. Chose projects that felt like joy instead of obligation. My first client was a single mom starting over after divorce. When she asked why I returned her deposit before she even signed the contract, I told her, because I've learned that clarity before commitment is power. She smiled and signed anyway. I began volunteering on weekends, helping women organize their legal and financial documents. It wasn't a job. It wasn't a crusade. It was just one woman sitting beside another, showing her how to build a folder labeled in case. And teaching her to believe that doing so didn't make her cold. It made her ready. One evening I walked to Louisa's old bench near the marsh. The air smelled like warm pine and salt water. I sat with a thermos of peppermint tea and let the quiet wrap around me. I thought of her. Of how she used to say legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you live by. And I realized, that's what I had now. Not just the house, not just the money, but a way of living that no one could steal. Some nights I still dream of Jenna. Sometimes she's younger, laughing in the backseat of our mother's car. Sometimes she's older, sitting beside me silently. No apologies, no blame, just there. And I wake up not angry, not aching, just aware. Some people are chapters, not endings. I walk lighter now. I answer my own questions instead of waiting for permission. I pour the good wine on a random Wednesday. Light candles without guests. Take photos of sunsets no one else will see. Because peace is the reward. And I earned it. The last thing I added to the bookshelf wasn't an object. It was a framed quote I printed myself. White paper, black font. Centered. It reads, "You can lose everything and still not lose yourself." It sits beside Louisa's garnet ring and Daniel's band. And a picture of me, eyes closed, face turned toward the light. If you've ever been rewritten, dismissed, forgotten. If you've ever had to prove you were telling the truth. If you've ever had to reclaim your place without asking. You're not alone. Tell your story below. Someone out there is still finding her voice. You are not alone. Every ending can be a new beginning. And your story isn't over, neither is mine. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more real stories of closure and empowerment. Your voice matters here. Let's keep building this legacy together.